The story of Armenian wine. And on the 7th month, the ark landed on top of Mount Ararat, and Noah began to grow plants and planted a vineyard. Then he made wine. It came out so good that he could not stand the temptation. He drank of it and got intoxicated. This is the first ever testimony on Armenian grapes and wine, as old as the world we know and as reliable as the Old Testament. Quite naturally, scholars came to prove millennia later that cultivated grapes have originated on the Armenian highlands. The land, which later became known as the cradle of civilization, on which the Armenian nation-states originated shortly thereafter. Artifacts from archaeological excavations support the fact that Armenia is origin of the grape species. This is also proven by the more than 600 grape varieties that exist on the territory of today's Armenia, shrunk many times since those days. And finally, there is ample linguistic evidence. The words Gini, Maran, Garas, and a dozen more others have been borrowed from Armenian by our neighbors close and far. The culture elevated to an art of creating wine was also transferred along. Little is known about the first Armenian nation-state, Hayassa. Instead, the grapes and wines of the second one, Nairi, are the subject of not only archaeological finds, but many an Assyrian inscription. For example, the war booty inventory of the 6 Assyrian raids on Armenia in the 9th century BC includes wine. It is not accidental that the specialist would later confirm the grapes that were subsequently grown in Assyria were of Armenian origin, and the Assyrian, Egyptian, and Armenian technologies of winemaking were identical. The land of Nairi, having gained power since the 9th century BC, was called Urartu by its neighbors, which meant the land of Ararat. Dozens of cuneiform inscriptions which survived those days attest, in order to validate the might of their reign and to gain everlasting life, Armenian kings had to build shrines and plant vineyards. As a token of love and immortality, the vineyards were called after their daughters and wives. Every spring, bulls were sacrificed to grapes in the temple of the principal god. Moreover, the sacrifice took place 3 more times a year, when grapes blossomed, when the vines bent on the heavy bunches, and finally during the harvest. As opposed to Assyrian inscriptions of plunder, Armenian kings told of the irrigation canals and cellars they had built, of desert transformed into budding vineyards. Every vineyard they planted was accompanied with a proud statement, "Through the power of God Chaldee, I have accomplished this heroic feat." When Armenian troops set out to conquer new lands, they always included winemakers, who were so important that they were noted in the lists alongside thousands of cavalrymen, spear throwers, and other personnel. The many requirements to be met by the new land included the ability to yield good wine. In the course of the 200 years that preceded the 7th century, the entire country was covered by vineyards, stretching first from the basin of Lake Van onto the Ararat Valley and the neighborhood of Lake Urmia. The scale of the cellars that were built back then is astounding. So are the irrigation canals. Still used today, the technological culture is amazing. chunks of sulfur found by the old wine vessels indicate that Armenians have been using sulfuric gas 3,000 years ago, without which current-day winemaking is still unthinkable. Charred grape pips found inside those vessels belong to the same local varieties grown today and can tell us a lot about the wine of those days. Tubes with sand of varying grain are proof of the use of fine filtration. On open-air platforms built by the sailors, wine was condensed in wintertime and exposed to scorching sun in the summer, indicating that Armenian wine got to neighboring countries without losses in its quality. It is not incidental that the enemies to establish their victory alongside ruined shrines also mentioned the vineyards they had set to fire. But even then, they were not able to hold back their amazement at the deeds of Armenian kings. One may sympathize with the sentiments of Assyrian Sargon II, which he experienced at the sight of endless canals and ducts that have turned wastelands into green fields, while the Armenian king showered grapes and fruits upon them. Great is his surprise at fragrant wines filling in numerous wineskins, large and small, which seemed endless even after his Myrian troops were inebriated. Of course, he had not come just to admire the wine of his adversary. He had come to raise and plunder, so that fear and devastation would reign here for centuries to come. He had come, as would his successor, to take along Armenian grapes, especially for that purpose taking Armenian winemakers among his listed prisoners. Strabo mentions that in the Hellenic period the country, which then stretched from one sea to another and was called Armenia by strangers, was completely covered by vineyards. Herodotus describes wine from the land of Armenians brought down Tigris and Euphrates on cowhide rafts to be sold in Assyria. Xenophon recounts fragrant wines and the outlandish barley drink he had tasted in Armenia around the same time, so strong that it had to be sipped through straws. The Greek traveler must have partaken of beer fortified with alcohol. Yes, alcohol, since its distillation technology as well as beer were known in Armenia for 400 years before Xenophon's arrival there. This is attested to by a cuneiform inscription of an Urartian king on grape spirit, in which he calls it the drink of kings.